My name's Mara Voss, and I want to say up front that I did not ask to be on that ship. I was hired through 3 layers of contractors to patch hull plating on a decommissioned hauler, and somewhere between the paperwork and the jump gate, I ended up bolted into the maintenance crew of an alien warfleet's flagship, the Severine. Nobody told me it was a flagship until I was already standing in the hangar bay, looking up at a drive core the size of a grain silo, wondering why it smelled like burnt copper. The fleet belonged to the Austrian Compact. Tall, silver-skinned people, with eyes like wet glass, very serious about rank, very bad at admitting when something had gone wrong. Their chief engineers wore 4 braids apiece and didn't speak to contractors. I wasn't a contractor to them. I was furniture. I fixed access panels and replaced gasket seals and kept my head down, because furniture that keeps its head down gets paid on time. 3 days before the fleet was supposed to retreat past the Threnna line ahead of an enemy advance, the drive core seized. Not failed, seized, like a fist closing. 11 engineers worked it in shifts. I watched them do it from the gantry above, because watching things break is most of what a mechanic does for a living before anyone lets her near the tools. The 11th engineer came up out of the core housing white, as a compact face can go, and told the Admiral, in front of the whole bay, that the core could not be restarted in time, that they'd have to abandon the Severine and scuttle her so the enemy wouldn't take the ship whole. The Admiral was named Tessavar Quill, and she did not look like the hollows of alien royalty you see in the recruitment posters. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been awake for 2 days holding a fleet together with her bare hands, and who had just been told the largest thing she commanded was dead weight she'd have to set on fire. "There has to be another option," she said, not loud, just flat. The way you say a thing you don't believe, but can't afford to stop believing. Nobody answered her. 11 braided engineers stood there with nothing to offer, and I stood up on the gantry with a torque wrench in my hand, because I'd been halfway through a panel job when the alarm started, and I thought, not heroically, not even on purpose, well, that's a terrible way to lose a ship. I climbed down. Took me longer than it should have, because the ladder was alien spec, and built for legs longer than mine. By the time I got to the core housing, 2 security officers were already moving to walk me back to quarters. Contractors don't belong on the command deck during a crisis, and the Admiral held up one hand and said, "Let her look." I don't know why she said it. Maybe she was just tired enough to try anything. I've thought about it since, and I think it might have been simpler than that. I was the only person in that bay who wasn't afraid to be wrong in front of her. I climbed into the core housing. It was hot enough to cook an egg on, and it stank of burnt copper because something in the secondary coil bank had cooked itself. And underneath the readouts and the diagnostic chatter coming through everyone's collar mics, I could hear it. A tick, 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 soft and wrong, like a clock running with a bent gear. Their engineers had spent 2 days running full diagnostic sweeps on a propulsion system that, near as I could tell, didn't have a fault in the propulsion system at all. It had a stuck relay. A physical, mechanical, dumb little relay arm that had warped from heat and welded itself half shut, and every diagnostic in the galaxy was going to tell you the core was dying, because from the outside, that's exactly what a stuck relay looks like. I didn't have compact tools. I had my own kit, because I never trust borrowed tools, and at the bottom of it, I had a crowbar I'd carried since my first job on a tugboat back home, because a crowbar doesn't care what century you're in, or what alphabet the warning labels are written in. I worked the flat end into the gap behind the relay housing, braced my boot against the bulkhead, and leaned my whole weight into it. It took 4 tries. On the 4th, the arm gave with a crack you could hear through the whole bay, and the tick, tick, tick stopped. And half a second later, the core lights went from red to amber to a low patient blue, like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. Nobody cheered. That's the part people don't expect. The bay just went very quiet. The particular quiet of a room full of trained professionals, realizing the answer had been sitting in a toolbox the whole time. The 11th engineer, the one who'd called it dead, came over and looked at the warped relay arm in my hand, like it had personally insulted him. "That is not a calibrated instrument," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's a crowbar." Admiral Quill came down off the command deck herself, which I gathered afterward was not a thing admirals did for hired hull patchers. She didn't shake my hand. Compact custom, I learned later, is to press 2 fingers to the inside of your wrist, which is apparently about as personal as their handshake gets. She did that, looked at the relay arm, looked at me, and said, "What is your name?" 3 days I'd been on that ship, and not one officer had asked me that. "Mara?" I said. "Mara Voss." "Mara Voss," she repeated, like she was filing it somewhere she intended to keep it. "You've just saved 1,100 lives, and one extremely expensive piece of metal." I was about to set fire to myself. "Mostly the metal," I said. "The lives were already going to be fine. They just would have had to walk home." She almost smiled. I think she'd forgotten how, for a few days, and was testing whether the muscles still worked. There was talk, after, of putting my name on a commendation. Talk of quarters upgraded, of a place on the bridge crew, of the kind of recognition that gets carved into a wall somewhere. I want to tell you I turned all of it down, out of some great principle, but the truth is simpler. I didn't want a desk on a bridge, and I didn't want my name on a wall. I wanted my crowbar back, and a working sonic wrench, and to go finish the hull plating job I'd actually been hired for, because somebody still had to do it and I was, after all, only furniture with a toolkit. What I got instead was smaller, and I think, better. 3 weeks later, the Severine made it past the Threnna line in one piece, and on the day we crossed, Admiral Quill walked the maintenance deck, which admirals also apparently don't do, and stopped at my panel, and asked how the gasket work was holding. I told her it was holding fine. She nodded, and moved on to the next station, and that was the whole of it. No parade, no braid on my collar, just a woman who ran 1,100 lives, knowing the name of the person who'd kept the ship under all of them, and treating her, from then on, like crew instead of cargo. I patched the hull. I finished the contract. When the Severine made port and my work was done, I packed my kit, crowbar and all, and went looking for the next job that needed fixing. That's the whole story. Nobody made me family. Nobody handed me a kingdom. They just, finally, knew my name. Some days that's worth more than the rest of it put together.